Lysandra Vale never imagined that one impulsive decision would turn her from a devoted Australian mother into the center of a nationwide manhunt. Kaden Vale was only 14 when his mother, Lysandra Vale, vanished into the night, leaving behind a silent house, an untouched dinner, and a mystery that would shock the country. Elias Crowe had charmed dozens of women online, but Lysandra Vale was the first one to disappear without a trace after meeting him. Marina Holt, the neighbor who knew everyone's secrets, was the first to sound the alarm when Lysandra Vale didn't come home, but even she couldn't have predicted what investigators would uncover. Detective Rowan Mace had seen his fair share of disturbing cases, but the trail left by Lysandra Vale would lead him into a world darker than anything he'd ever investigated. Solene Ward, the yacht's only surviving crew member, insisted that Lysandra Vale was terrified the last time she saw her, but no one believed her until it was too late. Elias Crowe promised Lysandra Vale an unforgettable night on a luxury yacht. He never said she might not live to see morning. Lysandra Vale had lived most of her adult life in the small coastal town of Ormond Bay, a place where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. The days were predictable, shaped by routines she had carefully built around her 17-year-old autistic son, Kaden. Their home sat on a quiet street, close to the shoreline, where the sounds of waves helped calm him on days when the world felt overwhelming. Lysandra rarely thought of herself anymore. Her life revolved around making Kaden's life manageable. She woke early each morning to prepare the same breakfast he preferred, made sure his daily schedule was clear and structured, and walked him through tasks that kept him grounded. Even on difficult days, she remained patient, reminding herself that she was his entire safety net. Before Kaden was born, she had imagined a different kind of adulthood, one filled with travel, adventure, and new experiences. But those dreams slowly dissolved as her responsibilities grew. She accepted this without bitterness, though sometimes she felt a quiet ache for the version of herself she used to imagine. Her part-time job at a small craft store was her only escape. But even there, she kept discussions light and avoided sharing much about her personal life. Over time, many people in Ormond Bay saw her as dependable, but no one truly knew her. It wasn't loneliness, exactly. It was more like fading into the background without anyone noticing. One evening, after putting Kaden to bed, Lysandra found herself scrolling through her phone long after she usually stopped using it. She stumbled onto an online travel community filled with photos of turquoise water, white-decked yachts, and sun-soaked luxury destinations she had never had the chance to visit. The images drew her in. She created a small profile, thinking it would simply be a harmless distraction. She began liking posts, reading comments, and sharing quiet admiration for places she secretly wished she could see in person. That was when she received her first message from someone named Rhys Corvin. His profile appeared polished and confident, showing a man in his mid-40s wearing crisp shirts and standing in front of elegant hotels. He described himself as a successful entrepreneur who traveled frequently. He commented that Lysandra seemed genuine, a word she hadn't heard directed at her in years. Their conversation started casually, but quickly grew into long exchanges late into the night. Rhys asked about her life, her interests, and what made her happy. Lysandra found herself answering questions she hadn't thought about in a long time. The more Rhys showed interest, the more Lysandra felt like she was being seen again. It wasn't romantic, it was something simpler, almost intoxicating, someone paying attention to her as a person rather than as a caretaker. Their exchanges became part of her nightly routine, and gradually she began staying up later, giving up small bits of sleep to feel connected to someone who seemed genuinely fascinated by her life. Weeks passed before Rhys extended an invitation. He told her about a private yacht party happening at a marina 2 hours away. He described it as a luxurious event with music, food, and interesting people from different parts of the world. He insisted she deserved a night to feel free, carefree even. Lysandra initially dismissed the idea, reminding herself that she had Kaden to think about and that it wasn't practical. But Riss continued encouraging her, painting the picture of one unforgettable evening. Slowly, her resistance began to soften. Deep down, she felt ashamed that the idea excited her. She told herself it wasn't reckless, just one night, a brief skate before returning to her responsibilities. She rationalized it by arranging for her kind neighbor, Kessia Dre, to check on Kaden. Kessia had helped before, and she trusted her. Knowing someone reliable would be nearby comforted her enough to consider the possibility. On the afternoon of the party, Lysandra looked at herself in the mirror longer than usual. She chose a dress she had saved for months to buy, one that made her feel like she wasn't just a tired single mother. As she drove toward the marina, she felt her nerves twisting, but there was also a flicker of hope. Hope that for a few hours she might feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She didn't know that the man waiting for her wasn't Riss Corvin at all. She didn't know the invitation was planned with precision. She only felt the wind on her face as she approached the unfamiliar harbor lights, unaware that the night ahead would not bring excitement, but danger woven carefully beneath charm and illusion. Lysandra arrived at the marina, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease as she stepped out of her car. The evening light reflected off rows of sleek vessels, each one more extravagant than anything she had ever seen. She followed the directions Riss had sent, walking down the wooden dock lined with soft golden lights. Luxuries surrounded her, music drifting through the air, laughter echoing from nearby decks, and the scent of salt water mixed with expensive colognes. Everything looked exactly like the photos Riss had shown her, which only strengthened the illusion that she belonged there. As she approached the yacht where Riss was supposedly waiting, she noticed that the vessel was larger than the others, with polished railings and a spotless white exterior. A man standing on the deck waved her over. She assumed he was part of the crew, but as she stepped closer, something felt slightly off. His smile seemed rehearsed, and his eyes followed her with an intensity she didn't understand. She brushed off the discomfort, reminding herself that people with money often behave differently than those she knew. Once aboard, the yacht's interior dazzled her. Soft lighting reflected off marble counters, and a table covered in carefully arranged appetizers stood near the entrance. She noticed only a handful of people inside, far fewer than she had expected from how Riss described the event. Still, the guests appeared relaxed, chatting quietly while holding drinks in tall glasses. No one seemed surprised to see her, but no one greeted her either. The silence made her feel out of place, yet she convinced herself it was simply a different social environment. A woman approached her with a drink, placing it gently in her hand before walking away. She hesitated, unsure if she should accept something from a stranger, but she didn't want to appear rude or inexperienced. She took a small sip, just enough to be polite. The flavor was strong and unfamiliar, and it seemed to burn slightly as it went down. She set the glass aside after that, not wanting to drink any more. Minutes passed without any sign of Riss. Lysandra checked her phone, scrolling through their messages to reassure herself she hadn't misunderstood the location. Everything matched what he had told her. She assumed he might simply be running late or was somewhere else on the yacht mingling with guests. She walked toward the upper deck, hoping to spot him among the small clusters of people. As she reached the railing, she felt the floor subtly shift beneath her. The yacht had begun to move away from the dock. Panic flickered inside her. She hadn't been told the yacht would leave. She looked around for a familiar face, but realized she barely recognized anyone on board. The few guests she passed seemed indifferent to her presence, their eyes sliding past her as if she wasn't worth noticing. A man she hadn't seen before approached her,
his posture calm, but his expression unreadable. He introduced himself as the event coordinator and told her that everything was going according to schedule. Something about the way he said it made her uneasy, as though he was reciting lines rather than speaking naturally. She asked him about Reese, and although she received an answer, it sounded vague and dismissive. He insisted that Reese was occupied and would join her soon. Her heartbeat quickened. She tried to steady herself by focusing on the view, dark water stretching endlessly beneath the night sky. The yacht picked up speed, cutting through the waves with unsettling ease. She wanted to call Kessia to check on Kaden, but she noticed her phone signal weakening until it disappeared entirely. With every passing moment, she felt more isolated, trapped at sea with strangers who didn't seem to care whether she felt safe or not. The man who had spoken to her earlier stepped away, disappearing into a restricted part of the yacht. The atmosphere shifted subtly, but she felt it, an undercurrent of tension, as if everyone knew something she didn't. She realized that she still hadn't seen Reese, and for the first time, she acknowledged the possibility that he might not be there at all. As the lights of the coastline faded into the distance, Lysandra understood that the night was no longer about excitement or escape. It was about survival. She was trapped at sea with strangers, and whatever intentions had brought her there were nothing like what she'd been promised.
Lysandra tried to steady her breathing as the yacht pushed farther into open water. The night air felt colder now, brushing against her skin with an edge that made her shiver. The soft music playing inside no longer sounded elegant or inviting. Instead, it seemed like an eerie soundtrack to a situation she didn't fully understand. She walked cautiously toward the lower deck, observing the behavior of the people around her. Their faces remained calm, too calm, as if none of them were surprised that a stranger had boarded the yacht without ever being greeted by the man who supposedly invited her. She made her way to the back of the vessel, hoping to find a lifeboat or some kind of emergency equipment. If the yacht continued deeper into the ocean, she wanted a way out. But strangely, every area that should have contained safety gear appeared locked or blocked by heavy panels she couldn't open. She tried to look confident, pretending she was simply exploring, but her movements grew quicker the more she realized how inaccessible everything was. As she turned a corner, she noticed the same woman who had given her the drink earlier. The woman stood near a narrow hallway, speaking softly to one of the crew members. Lysandra paused, staying out of view, and watched their body language. The conversation looked serious, almost anxious. The crew member glanced in her direction more than once, and each time the woman responded with a small nod. Lysandra felt her stomach tighten. They weren't just working, they were watching her. She headed back toward the open deck, trying to appear calm, even as her pulse thudded loudly in her ears. She told herself to observe, to think, to avoid panicking. If she lost control now, she would only make herself more vulnerable. She noticed details she had missed earlier. The way the yacht's windows were tinted so darkly that she couldn't see inside certain rooms. The lack of small talk between guests, the absence of casual laughter that should have filled a party atmosphere. Everything felt staged, carefully curated, unnaturally stiff. When she approached a side door leading to the kitchen area, she found it ajar. She slipped inside, finding herself in a polished stainless steel space with neatly organized counters. But what captured her attention was a small cluster of personal items on the table: a sleek phone, a wallet, and a stack of unfamiliar cards. She glanced around to make sure she was alone, then picked up one of the cards. It had a woman's picture on it with a different name and a different hometown. The birth date didn't match the photo. She checked another card and another, each depicting someone different, but all with mismatched or inconsistent information. Her hands trembled. These weren't souvenirs. They were identities, possibly stolen ones. A horrible thought crossed her mind. What if she had been brought here for the purpose of becoming another one of these identities? Her fear deepened when she noticed a small notebook partially tucked under the stack. Inside were scribbled dates, initials, and what looked like coded entries. Whatever this group was doing, it involved meticulous planning. She placed everything back exactly as she found it, making sure not to leave any trace of her presence. She stepped out of the kitchen, but as she did, she felt someone watching her. She turned slightly and saw the same intense-eyed man from earlier, standing near the doorframe. His expression was unreadable, but his presence felt deliberate, as though he'd been waiting for her to emerge. He didn't say anything he didn't need to. His silent stare raised every alarm within her. She walked away quickly, not daring to look back. She realized then that she wasn't simply an overlooked guest. She was being monitored, evaluated, possibly targeted. The yacht cut through the waves with steady force, and the coastline had vanished completely. She stood on the deck again, gripping the railing just to steady herself. Far below, the ocean churned in darkness, a reminder that escape by water would be nearly impossible now. She felt terror rising, but she also felt a flicker of determination. She had left Kaden behind, trusting Kessia to keep him safe for a few hours. No matter what happened on this yacht, she needed to stay alert and survive. She had to find a way home, not just for herself, but for the boy who depended on her for everything. The night was far from over, and she sensed that the true danger hadn't even revealed itself yet.
Lysandra moved cautiously along the upper deck, trying to blend into the background as the yacht sailed deeper into open water. By now, the moon hung high above, casting a pale glow over the dark ocean. The air smelled colder, sharper, and every sound, the creak of the vessel, the splash of waves, seemed amplified in the stillness. She scanned the deck for anything that could serve as a clue or a means of escape, but each section appeared deliberately controlled, almost too tidy. She sensed that every movement she made was being quietly evaluated by unseen eyes. She retreated to a corner near the railing, pretending to admire the view. In reality, she needed time to think. She replayed everything that had happened since her arrival: the forced politeness of the guests, the missing host, the yacht setting sail without warning, the hidden identities in the kitchen. She didn't know exactly what these people were involved in, but she understood enough to know she had stepped into something far more dangerous than a simple scam. She considered whether she could confront someone or demand answers, but she quickly dismissed the idea. Any wrong step could expose her suspicion, and she wasn't sure if these people were capable of violence. Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed activity near the far end of the deck. A door had opened, revealing a brief glimpse of a brightly lit room filled with monitors and equipment. A man in dark clothing stepped out, carrying a tablet and speaking into a device clipped to his collar. Lysandra saw the glow of screens showing maps, numbers, and what looked like profiles of different people. The door shut quickly, but not before she noticed what looked like her own picture on one of the display panels. Her chest tightened. She had not been invited to a party. She had been targeted. She forced herself not to react, keeping her expression neutral. She walked slowly toward the opposite side of the deck, putting distance between herself and the room. She needed a plan. If she couldn't escape the yacht physically, she had to wait for an opportunity to gather information or find help from someone who might not be fully aligned with the group. As she passed the staircase leading to the lower levels, she heard footsteps behind her. She quickened her pace, but didn't break into a run. She understood instinctively that showing fear would only make her a more obvious target. When she reached a narrow hallway near the back of the vessel, she ducked into a small lounge area, hoping to find a place to hide. Instead, she found a lone figure sitting by the window, a young man who looked noticeably out of place among the elegant guests. His posture was tense, and he seemed lost in his own thoughts. His clothes didn't match the luxurious attire of the others, and his shoes were scuffed, as if he had been brought here unexpectedly. Lysandra watched him carefully, assessing whether he might be someone she could trust. The moment he noticed her presence, the same unease she felt reflected in his eyes. That flicker of fear told her he wasn't part of the group controlling the yacht. He shifted nervously and avoided making eye contact, as though he was afraid to draw attention. Lysandra wondered if he, too, had been lured here by deceptive promises. His presence raised a new question. How many others had fallen into the same trap? She wanted to approach him, to whisper something that would confirm he wasn't an accomplice, but she couldn't risk alerting anyone watching. Before she could decide what to do, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. She ducked behind a tall cabinet, peering through a narrow gap. Two men walked past, speaking in low voices. She couldn't make out their words, but their tone was urgent. One held a clipboard with printed documents, while the other carried a keycard that he slid into a panel near a restricted door. The lock beeped, and they disappeared inside. When the hallway fell silent again, she stepped out from her hiding place and glanced back at the young man. He was gone, vanished as quietly as he had appeared. Fear prickled at her spine. She didn't know whether he had been taken or had simply moved elsewhere to avoid detection. Feeling increasingly exposed, she returned to the main deck. The wind had grown stronger, causing the yacht to sway slightly. She gripped the railing tightly and stared into the endless darkness of the sea. She understood now that these people weren't merely running a scam. They were orchestrating something far more calculated and possibly criminal. She sensed layers of deception she hadn't yet uncovered, and every passing moment deepened her sense of urgency. Somewhere, below deck, she heard the muffled sound of something heavy being moved. It served as a chilling reminder that she couldn't afford to be discovered exploring off-limits areas. She had to stay ahead of whatever plans these people had for her. The night pressed on, heavy and suffocating. Lysandra wasn't just fighting fear, she was fighting time, and she knew the window to escape or find help was closing rapidly.
Lysandra gripped the railing as the yacht continued slicing through the dark water, feeling the vessel's steady hum vibrating beneath her feet. She knew she couldn't stay in the open any longer. Being visible made her an easy target, and the way the crew members monitored her movements left no doubt that she was being assessed for something she didn't yet understand. Every instinct told her she needed to gather as much information as possible before making any attempt to escape. She slipped back inside, moving quietly along a dim corridor that branched away from the main lounge. The ambient noise of distant conversations faded behind her, replaced by the steady thrum of the engines. The narrow hallway led to a series of unmarked doors, each one locked. She tested them discreetly, avoiding any sudden movements. One door rattled slightly, not fully latched. She paused, listening carefully for footsteps, before easing it open just enough to peer inside. The small room beyond was filled with boxes, crates, and sealed packages. None were labeled in a way that made sense, just codes, barcodes, and long strings of numbers. Some of the crates were stamped with international shipping markings, hinting that the yacht's operations extended far beyond one night or one victim. She stepped inside and crouched beside a partially open crate. Inside, bundles of documents were banded together along with electronic devices carefully wrapped in protective foam. The sight confirmed her worst fear. This wasn't just a scam or a social trap. It was part of an organized network dealing in stolen identities, trafficking, or something equally dark. As she sifted through one of the bundles, she found a folder containing photographs. Her breath caught in her throat when she recognized the young man she had seen earlier in the lounge. The picture was clipped to a file filled with personal data, details someone had collected about him without his knowledge. Below his photo, several notes had been handwritten in red ink, but she couldn't decipher what they meant. She scanned through the rest of the files, realizing that every person pictured looked ordinary, unsuspecting, and vulnerable, just like her. She placed the folder back exactly where she found it and closed the crate as quietly as she could. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She needed to get off this yacht, but she still had no idea how far they had traveled or how long she had before someone noticed she was missing. The absence of any working phone signal left her completely cut off from the outside world, and the crew seemed to control every inch of the vessel. She slipped back into the hallway and headed toward the deck's far end where she remembered seeing a small emergency exit sign earlier. Before reaching it, she stopped abruptly when she heard hushed voices approaching from around the corner. She ducked behind a narrow alcove just as two crew members walked past, carrying a locked metal case between them. Their conversation was short but urgent, and although she couldn't make out every word, she caught fragments, references to schedules, extra precautions, and someone being prepared. Their footsteps receded, but the tension they left behind lingered thickly. She stepped out of the alcove and followed the corridor toward the exit. When she pushed the door open, she found herself on a lower deck, closer to the waterline. The area was darker, quieter, and noticeably colder. She scanned the deck, searching for anything that could help her escape: life jackets, a small emergency boat, or even a communication device. But just like the upper deck, everything necessary for safety seemed restricted behind locked compartments. Then, at the far end of the deck, something caught her attention:
a small maintenance raft was tethered to the yacht, partially covered by a tarp. It wasn't a proper lifeboat, but it floated, and that alone made it her only chance. She crouched beside it and examined the knots. They were tight, but not impossible to undo. Her hands trembled as she worked at the rope, aware that one mistake, a snapped line or a loud thud, could alert someone inside. Just as she started loosening the final knot, she heard a door slam open above her. Footsteps thundered down the metal stairs. Light spilled across the deck as a beam of flashlight swept over the area. Lysandra froze. Her heart raced as she slid behind a stack of coiled ropes, pressing herself into the shadows. The flashlight lingered for a moment too long. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it moved away. The footsteps retreated. The door slammed shut. Lysandra exhaled shakily. She knew now more than ever that if she wanted to survive, she had to act quickly and decisively. The window of opportunity was shrinking, and whatever the people on board were planning, she was not meant to leave this yacht alive. She turned back toward the raft, knowing that she only had one chance before the night closed in around her completely.
Lysandra waited several minutes in the shadows, letting her heartbeat slow to something that felt controllable. Even in the darkness, she could see the faint sheen of sweat on her hands, the tremor in her fingers, a reminder of how close she had come to being discovered. The maintenance raft was still her only hope, yet she couldn't move toward it until she was absolutely certain no one remained on the deck. She listened closely. Only the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull and the distant hum of the yacht's engines broke the silence. For now, she was alone. She turned her attention back to the raft and resumed working at the rope. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy from fear and cold, but she forced herself to stay steady. Each knot came undone with agonizing slowness. The yacht rocked gently, adding to the difficulty, but she reminded herself that freedom depended on her not giving up. When the final knot loosened, her pulse quickened with fragile hope. She eased the rope away, making sure it didn't snap or scrape against the metal railing. Before she could climb into the raft, a low mechanical noise caught her attention. It wasn't footsteps or voices. This was something heavier, something industrial. She turned her head toward the open water and saw another vessel approaching in the distance. Its lights were dim, barely noticeable against the dark horizon. But the closer it came, the clearer its shape became. It wasn't a fishing boat or a leisure craft. Its angular silhouette and steady, deliberate movement suggested something more specialized. She had no idea if it was connected to the people on the yacht, but the timing felt too precise to be coincidence. The raft no longer felt like a guaranteed escape. If she lowered it now, she risked being spotted by whoever was on the incoming vessel. Without knowing whether they were friend or threat, she couldn't take the chance. She quietly pulled the tarp back over the raft and retreated to the shadows again. Every instinct screamed at her to hide. She crept along the lower deck, searching for another place to conceal herself. A small ventilation access panel near the stern caught her attention. It was partially open, likely left that way by maintenance staff. She crouched beside it and tested the panel. It opened just wide enough for her to squeeze inside. The interior was cramped, filled with pipes and wiring conduits, but dark and sheltered. It would keep her hidden until she could observe what was happening without being exposed. She slid inside, pulling the panel closed behind her. Darkness enveloped her, thick and claustrophobic. The faint smell of oil and metal filled her lungs. She pressed her ear against the cold surface of the panel, just as the other vessel drew close enough for her to hear voices shouting orders. The two vessels bumped lightly against each other, and she felt the yacht shift under the impact. Heavy boots clattered along the deck as people began boarding. She forced herself to breathe silently. Muffled voices carried through the metal barrier. She couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough to understand what was happening. The yacht crew was handing over crates. possibly the same one she had found earlier in the storage room. The operation was coordinated, practiced, and not in the least bit secretive among those involved. Whoever boarded the yacht wasn't an enemy to them, they were partners. As she continued to listen, she heard something more chilling, mention of inventory checks and new profiles ready for transport. She understood instantly that profiles referred to the identity file she had found, and transport implied that people were being moved as if they were goods. A realization sank into her with suffocating weight. Whatever criminal network these people belonged to, it wasn't small, and she had narrowly escaped becoming one of their next targets. Her hiding spot grew warmer as the machinery around her ran, but she stayed perfectly still. The sounds outside grew louder. Footsteps moved closer to her location, and someone banged against the panel she hid behind. The vibrations jolted through her body like electricity. She clasped her hands over her mouth to suppress a gasp. The panel didn't open, and the footsteps eventually moved away, but the terror lingered. After what felt like an hour, though likely much less, the engine of the second vessel roared to life. She felt the yacht shift again as the boat separated. The mechanical sounds faded into the distance until only the original hum of the yacht remained. She waited longer still, unable to risk emerging too soon. When she finally pushed the panel open, she inhaled a shaky breath. The deck was empty. No boots thudded, no orders were barked. The ocean around her stretched in every direction, silence under the pale moon. She knew she couldn't stay on the lower deck. Eventually, someone would notice the loosened knots on the raft or the displaced tarp. Her best chance now wasn't to run, but to vanish inside the yacht and find something she could use to fight back or call for help. She crept toward an entrance door and slipped inside, finding herself in a quiet corridor near the engine room. The air was warmer here, and the faint roar of the engines masked the sound of her footsteps. She moved quickly, taking care to avoid brightly lit areas where security cameras might be installed. She followed the corridor to a set of stairs leading upward. She climbed them slowly, listening for any sound from above. When she reached the next deck, she found herself near another lounge area, this one empty, except for a glass on the table and a half-folded blanket draped over a chair. She wondered if the young man she saw earlier had been resting there. The thought pushed her to search for him. She moved down another hallway and found a partially open door. Inside was a small cabin with 2 beds. One was neatly made. The other had sheets thrown aside as if someone had left in a hurry. A backpack lay on the floor, unzipped. Inside, she found a passport, a disposable phone, and clothing that clearly belonged to a young man. It was his room. Had he escaped or been taken? She searched the cabin further, finding something that made her heart pound with new urgency. A small notebook filled with handwritten entries. They were messy, hurried, and emotional. The young man had documented his experience on the yacht, describing how he had been lured on board by a woman who promised him a job. He realized too late that the offer was fake. They had locked him in the cabin and forced him to comply by threatening someone he cared about. He wrote about hearing conversations referring to profiles, deliveries, and disposals. The last entry was unfinished, ending abruptly with a line describing footsteps outside his door. Lysandra's fear sharpened into determination. Someone needed to expose this. Someone needed to survive. She pushed the notebook into her dress pocket, zipped the young man's bag quietly, and stepped out of the cabin. She froze. Immediately. A shadow stretched across the hallway. Someone was standing at the end of the corridor, watching her. She couldn't see the person's face, but she recognized the silhouette. The same intense-eyed man who had stared at her earlier. He took one step forward, and Lysandra knew there was no more time
for hiding.
Lysandra felt her entire body tense as the silhouette at the end of the corridor stepped closer. The harsh lighting above cast a distorted shadow behind him, stretching across the wall like a reaching limb. She didn't dare move. The air felt thick, as though the yacht itself had stopped breathing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to respond. Her mind raced, trying to calculate possibilities, escape routes, hiding spots, anything, but there was no time to act. The man with the intense eyes walked forward with a calmness that terrified her more than sudden aggression would have. He didn't seem hurried or angry. He looked like someone who had already made a decision about her fate. His steps were steady, confident, almost rehearsed. Lysandra backed up slowly, keeping her hands low and her breathing quiet. She didn't want to provoke him, but she also refused to surrender. He stopped several feet away, far enough to block the hallway, but close enough that she could see details of his face. He was expressionless, his features carved into an emotionless mask. His eyes were the only thing that seemed alive, sharp, calculating, taking in her every twitch. She felt those eyes scanning her like she was an object being evaluated, not a human being with fear pulsing through her. He didn't speak, but his posture shifted imperceptibly, signaling that he expected her to walk toward him. She remained still. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Without warning, he stepped to the side and motioned with his hand, directing her toward the staircase. It wasn't a request. He wanted her to move deeper into the yacht. She swallowed hard. If she followed him, she risked being cornered in a place where escape was impossible. But if she refused, he could drag her or knock her unconscious, leaving her even more vulnerable. She couldn't win through physical force. Her only advantage was timing. As she stepped forward cautiously, she kept her mind sharp, noting every detail around her, the placement of doors, distances between objects, shadows where someone could be hiding. She needed to stay aware of everything. Her chance to escape would come, but she had to survive long enough to recognize it. He led her to a mid-level deck she hadn't explored yet. Unlike the luxurious lounges and elegant cabins, this area was plain and utilitarian. The hallway lights flickered occasionally, and pipes lined the ceiling. It felt like the true underbelly of the yacht, where practical work happened, far from the staged glamour meant to lure people like her. He stopped in front of a heavy metal door, unlocked it with a keycard, and stepped aside for her to enter. She hesitated, glancing inside. The room was small, with no windows. A single chair sat in the center, and a metal table rested against the wall. It looked like an interrogation room, stripped of anything personal or decorative. Lysandra understood instantly what this meant. They wanted information. Or compliance. Or both. But stepping inside would seal her in. She needed time. She needed an opening. She turned her head, pretending to hesitate out of fear rather than strategy. The man's jaw tightened slightly. That tiny reaction, barely noticeable, was enough for her to tell he could grow impatient. Impatience meant mistakes, and mistakes meant opportunity. Before she could act on that thought, another figure appeared behind him, a woman she had seen earlier handing out drinks. Her presence made the situation even more dangerous. Lysandra's chance to escape would be harder now, with two of them controlling the space. The woman whispered something to the man. He nodded and stepped into the room first, likely expecting Lysandra to follow. The woman positioned herself behind Lysandra, blocking the exit. This was it. The trap was closing. The moment the man turned his back, Lysandra made her move. She lunged sideways, using her shoulder to ram the woman with an unexpected force. The woman lost her balance and slammed into the wall. She didn't wait to see what happened next. She sprinted down the hallway, her heartbeat pounding like a warning bell. Footsteps thundered behind her. Shouts echoed through the metal walls. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she turned blindly down corridors she didn't recognize. The yacht had become a maze of harsh lights and intersecting hallways, but the only direction that mattered was away. She darted into a narrow passageway and found a door that led upward. She took the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the sharp burn in her lungs.
At the top, she stumbled into a storage area filled with equipment cases. She pushed one of them behind the door to slow her pursuers, then continued forward. The door burst open moments later, the equipment case sliding across the floor from the force. Voices spread out behind her, multiple people now, searching, splitting into groups. They were hunting her. She crossed the storage area and found another exit leading to a side corridor. The lights flickered, making the shadows dance. She followed it until she reached a small control station with several screens showing security feeds of the yacht. For a split second, she froze, watching herself from a camera angle above. They were monitoring everything. Footsteps approached again. She had only seconds. She grabbed a metal rod leaning against the wall, maybe a tool, maybe part of the equipment, and smashed the panel board. Sparks flew, screens blinked into darkness. The hallway lights momentarily dimmed and alarms began to blare. The yacht jolted, as if some system had been disrupted. She staggered back and ran again, weaving through the corridors as sirens echoed through the vessel. The chaos she caused was buying her time. People would be scrambling to figure out what had malfunctioned, giving her precious moments to find a real escape. She pushed through a door and emerged onto an open deck. Cold wind hit her face, whipping her hair wildly. The ocean stretched endlessly around her, and although it terrified her, it also reminded her that outside meant freedom. Somewhere on this yacht there had to be a way off. She scanned the deck and spotted a davit system, a small crane used for lowering emergency rafts. 2 crew members were running from the opposite direction. She sprinted towards the equipment, pulling at the release lever. It jammed. The crew members shouted at her. She yanked the lever again. It didn't budge. As they drew closer, she reached for a loose piece of metal on the crane and used it as leverage. She slammed it down with all her strength. It cracked. The release clicked. The emergency raft dropped halfway down toward the water, not fully deployed, but close enough. The crew members were almost on top of her. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She jumped. Her body plunged into icy water, the cold stealing her breath instantly. The shock radiated through her bones, but she forced herself upward, kicking and clawing toward the surface. Her head broke through and she gasped for air. The raft bobbed a few feet away. She swam to it with frantic strokes, pulling herself onto the slippery surface. Shouts echoed from the yacht. A spotlight snapped on, sweeping across the waves. She flattened herself against the raft, trying to stay hidden. The yacht roared forward, circling sharply, searching. Wind whipped the waves higher. Salt burned her eyes, but she stayed low, gripping the raft's edge and praying that darkness and distance would keep her safe. Minutes crawled by, each one feeling like a lifetime. Then the spotlight passed over her for the last time. The yacht turned away. It disappeared into the horizon. And Lysandra, soaked, freezing, and clinging to the raft, realized that she had done what none of the others before her had managed. She had escaped. But the night wasn't over. Out here, alone, on the open sea, survival would demand even more strength. And whatever she uncovered on that yacht, the identities, the network, the stolen lives, they weren't going to let her go easily.